everyone. Welcome to the first part of our Reimagining the Local State conference today. It's great to have you all here for our opening panel, which is focused on reimagining devolution, stronger communities at every scale. I'm James Sweetland. I'm one of the senior researchers at Reform, and I'm delighted to be chairing this wonderful panel. So in terms of the topic, we know that much of the conversation about devolution is rooted around the largest units of power, the centre, combined authorities in particular, and this is undoubtedly a positive thing, and it's something Reform have been working on for a long time. It's a step forward from centralism by default. But this is of course only part of the story. It's only the first step. The next part is to move power closer to local communities, to focus on the local and hyper-local forms of devolution that put people in the driving seat. And this is the focus of our panel today. Fortunately, we have an absolutely fantastic set of speakers here to discuss this essential topic. So we have Deborah Cadman, OBE, the Chief Executive of Birmingham City Council. We have Bev Craig, the leader of Manchester City Council. Ailbhe McNabola, the Director of Policy and Communications at Power to Change, who are also very kindly sponsoring today's panel. And Jen Williams, the Northern England Correspondent for the Financial Times. In terms of structure, we've got until 12:15, so enough time to have a really useful, substantive conversation. We're going to begin with a question for each of our panellists in lieu of opening statements before we open up to a wider discussion. But also in the spirit of today's event, we don't want to be kind of hoarding power up here on the stage. We want to be involving all of you in the conversation as well. So around half of our time will be audience Q&A from you, our audience. So do start thinking of your questions. We'll try to get as many of you in as possible. I'm hoping that given we've got the slots just after morning kind of caffeination, that we'll have some lively ones too. So with that, let's get started. So first up with yourself, Deborah. So I think there's a fairly intuitive connection between hyperlocal devolution and community problems. You know, we give power to a community, they can open a local hub that provides services in an area, and run a sports facility which helps local families. But that connection between hyperlocal devolution and the kind of vast structural challenges we face, so things like climate change, net zero, successive generations of inequality and disadvantages, is perhaps slightly less obvious. From your perspective, as someone who's been at the heart of both the combined authority and the country's largest city council, what is your view on how the hyperlocal can play a part in tackling these vast issues?
Thank you, James. Does it work?
Sure.
There you go. And really lovely to see you, Charlotte.
Likewise.
And good morning, everyone. So one of the things I know to be true is that if you want resilient and sustainable communities, you've got to focus on those communities and that community capital as the starting point. And I genuinely know this to be true. Reimagining Whitehall was quite a cathartic process that we went through, and it was important because we've also got to see everything that we do within the border system, and you can't reimagine the local or the regional without also reimagining the national, because there are symbiotic relationships throughout all of them in the system. So again, I wouldn't want you to think that we can find a solution or we can come up with an alternative without looking at the system as a whole. Now, after hearing your introduction, Charlotte, I have actually changed what I'm going to say because it's important that we kind of reinforce and reflect what you said, which is completely true. And if you look at the three ingredients that the original paper proposed around state, community, and market, I think those ingredients are absolutely right. It's the recipe that we need to think about. So even at a city level in Birmingham, because we have so many different communities, the way in which we intervene or act as a city council in one area of Birmingham needs to be different in another area. So the three ingredients are true, but the recipe needs to flex and be agile and represent the places within the city. So if you take the state, one of the things that we're doing in Birmingham at the moment is just looking at the way in which we can break this cycle that we're in, where we're continuously addressing those people who are in crisis. And if you acknowledge that the unemployment rate in Birmingham is equal to, and in some places worse than Manchester, if you look at the fact that we've got 40% of our children living in poverty, if you look at the fact that we've got a third of our children who are not school ready by the age of 4. It is, you can see the big challenges that we've got, and we will always be at that fever pitch where we're addressing that crisis. So we are being really intentional and saying, as a state in the city, we are going to make the decision to focus more on early intervention and prevention. Now that's quite brave, because we're having to divert resources away from crisis, but we know, and hopefully everybody in this room agrees and understands, that if you don't break that cycle of crisis, you will always be in that cycle of crisis. So we're looking at how we intervene, how we build capacity and resilience in our communities, but how we prevent people tipping into crisis in the first place. And we're being very intentional as the local state in doing that. If you look at community, my view is, some people say, can we really afford to invest in our communities in the way that we're doing it? My response to that is, can we afford not to? And certainly after the Commonwealth Games, on which we were extraordinary, may I say, but after the Commonwealth Games, what we found was that those people who volunteered throughout the Commonwealth Games, those people that benefited from all of that investment and engagement at a community level, are knocking on our door saying, we want to continue operating and working in this way. So for us not to respond to that in a positive way would just be ridiculous. So the investment we made in community sport, investment that we made in community culture, investment that we made in developing our communities and investing in the infrastructure of our communities has got to continue. But also we've got to accept that there are times when we've got to step back. So I had a really, challenging community engagement session where local people were saying, we're friends of the local park, we do our little picks at the weekend. We just actually want you to get out of the way because we're far better at it than you are. Enabling us, support us, but just get out of the way and let us do it. And that's been quite a challenge to the local state in the city council. Now my view is, knock yourself out. I'm absolutely of the view that we need to support our communities to be as resilient as they can. And then the market, again, being hyper-local in the market, we've got some amazing investments that are happening in the city. There is some market failure that we need to intervene and deal with, so brownfield land, unless we level up that market, we're never going to get the investment that we need and the affordable housing that we need. So there's that interventionist role that we need to take as the local state. But more importantly, we need to make sure that whatever investment we attract and keep in the city is the right investment. So there is a private sector organisation that will be investing £2 billion in the city over a period of 10 years, 10-15 years, and that's a kind of generation. Now, my challenge to them is, if you are going to invest that amount of money for that amount of time, you cannot simply invest in the infrastructure. You've got to invest in the communities around you. Because, at the end of those 15 years, those kids that are in school are going to be the people that are providing the skills for your programme to be successful. So you need to invest right now in that community to ensure that you get what you need in order to be as successful as you want to be. So there are different conversations we're having with the market at a local state as well. Now, Simon has heard me rant on numerous occasions about the different levels of governance and government in this country. I do think we're too centralised. I do think, and certainly during COVID, one of the most disgraceful events that happened was that the central government was making decisions about how people should be supported when they were shielding. And you can't decide what food people are going to have in Birmingham from London and Whitehall. So we had, of course, all of those stories are true, when Muslim families had sausage rolls in, it's not even funny, is it? Sausage rolls in their kind of food packages. And now I exaggerate that to make the point. Now, it's about trust. So central government has got to trust the local state to make the decisions in hand with their communities to deliver the right services in the right way, at the right time. as well. So I could go on ranting about my kind of antipathy about that, but equally, you know, we are resetting the relationship with the combined authority. It doesn't help, does it, that the kind of competitive nature about levelling up and investment zones means that there's just a kind of uncomfortable kind of environment about what that looks like, what it means, who's going to get what. So you end up having a mad competition amongst each other, where the reality is we should be competing with other people, not amongst ourselves. So there is another conversation to be had about some of the structures coming from Whitehall and how it kind of builds in this immediate competitiveness and pulling against each other, where the reality is none of this should be a zero-sum game.
Thank you very much, Deborah. If that's ranting, you rant much more eloquently than I do. Bev, we're obviously delighted to be here in Manchester on your patch, as it were, and the reform team have contested the transport network, the bars and the restaurants of Manchester. They're all in very good work.
Keep your money coming to the local economy, but no,
we did our best. In recent months, Manchester has, of course, agreed this really significant new devolution deal, and when it was announced, Bev, if you'll let me quote you, you described it as another significant step forwards in part of your commitment to bring power closer to communities. So, what is your vision for getting the most out of this new deal, and how can Manchester City Council ensure it benefits from the combined authority's new autonomy?
So I would start by saying that, and it's a point that I've made in many places before, that where we are on our path to devolution in this country is incremental. And I think, I'm sure colleagues in Birmingham and the West Midlands would agree that actually, if we talk about the journey that one of the most centralised states in the Western world has to go on to get towards meaningful and true devolution, which involves power, autonomy and resource flowing down to the right level of decision making, then I think we're only part of the way on the journey. I think what we've seen with the latest tranche of devolution through our trailblazers is some additional powers around what we had already, which is transport, policing, fire through the police and crime commissioner roles, and some small but significant strategic responsibility around spatial frameworks and planning, and what we had around local education for adults' budgets. And I think we've seen a build on that, that's seen more of that flow around integrated transport, more of it flow around thinking about some of the frameworks that we need for housing. But actually, the reality is we need to have, as a country, a much more fundamental discussion as to who delivers what and where. But in that conversation, not forgetting the why point. And I think the why, for me, is fundamental. So I suppose just to reflect a few minutes on where Manchester finds itself in the context of Greater Manchester, because there's a risk that we all bandy around labels when we talk about localism, we talk about local, hyper-local, and we all have slightly different interpretations for that. For me, local is at a City Council local authority level. For me, hyper-local is what all of the international evidence shows to be the lowest possible level that's good for neighbourhood working. So hyper-local, in a Manchester context, is the work that we do with a population of almost 600,000 people into neighbourhoods, and those neighbourhoods are statistically between 30 to 50,000 people, because that's what the evidence shows. Taking those decisions at those levels really means hyper-local to be. But we're a city of almost 600,000 people. A city that's grown by nearly 200,000 people in the last 20 years, for as long as I've been here. But a city that, too often when we think about Manchester, we don't think about the purpose as to Manchester's been trying to achieve that growth. And that, I think, then gets in the way when we talk about city regions, when we talk about levelling up, and we talk about some of the challenges that Deborah's outlined in relation to poverty. You know, it's a scandal, but the child poverty statistics that came out just this week showing that Manchester is the third worst local authority, the third highest level of child poverty statistics in the country. And that actually in Greater Manchester we remain the most deprived local authority, sixth in the country. That's a scandal. And that when we talk about levelling up, we talk about need, acuity of need, particularly in diverse populations, has changed significantly over the last 13 years. And there have been some national policy drivers that have not just enabled that, but exacerbated that, and we have to be honest about that. So when we reflect about how we use power and we use devolution and control to start to shift some of those conversations, there's a few examples that I draw on. So thinking about the acuity of need in a city like Manchester and thinking about our skills challenge. I always use 2003 in many ways as a point of reference. Nothing special happened that year. I moved to Manchester and it's dead easy to think about statistics in that time, so it's a very handy sort of 20 years ago snapshot. 20 years ago in Manchester, 24% of all residents of working age had no formally recognised skills or qualifications. That now stands at 8%. So whilst we talk about the remaining gap of the fact that almost 1 in 4 residents in the city aren't in real living wage jobs or above, actually over time there's been some significant changes and interventions that's been made. And that's why the first thing that I talk about is the importance of localism when it comes to economic strategy and economic planning. Because actually, off the top of my head, I can think of over an additional 150 million quid that's been generated in social value just from the programmes that we're doing from a local authority around regeneration. So understand it with purpose, what it is we want to achieve for and with our local communities, I think sits really firmly. I think the conversation then around how wider geographical areas work together will be one I think that will have to be had in great detail in the country. In places like Manchester and Greater Manchester, as a city region we've got a long-term established relationship around cooperation. We make sense as a geographic area, and I think that's also something to be factored into. When we talk about localism, we talk about taking decisions at the lowest geographical level possible. Those areas have to matter to people. Because in reality, for most people, local authority boundaries, for most people in this country, the only difference often is what colour their bins are and who benefits from the council tax. And as a local authority leader, obviously, you love to think that the most important thing going on in someone's life, but in reality, much of it comes down to who do they complain to if something doesn't work, and actually who's enabling a lot of the things behind the scenes that residents mostly don't want to be able to engage with. And I suppose then the next thing for me is the areas where we should be working with even further cooperation. Because if you work on the basis that we know our local communities better, not just in the examples that Deborah's given through COVID, but if I think about what we've done through the Our Manchester strategy around having place-based working that puts our values at the heart of it, a lot of that's been around early intervention, and it's been working with communities, understanding that people who may be experiencing poverty, hardship and vulnerability don't define themselves in that sense. So I grew up with no money. At no point until I get older did I realise that we would have been categorised as poor. And there's something around dignity in our language as how we work with communities that I think is fundamental. So if you think about how in Manchester we've changed our model around early help, we're starting to see real success in that. Over 80% of children who were previously in need of statutory services post-intervention weren't. We're reducing and booking trends when it comes to the number of looked after children in our care. We're reducing and booking trends nationally when it comes to people that are experiencing reablement in our adult social care that don't need hospitalisation, don't need long-term care, because they're getting what they need at the lowest possible level that supports them in the best way as possible. So we have ideas, I think at a local level, that reshapes national services, and I would point to GM examples that we've worked on in the city for some time that are working well. A redefinition of how you work with people with long and enduring mental illness and health complexities over a period of time to get them back into work. If DWP adopted that model across the country tomorrow, not only would they improve people's lives, but they'd save the state money. And that gets to the heart of actually what we're asking for when it comes to devolution and power. It's control to change the things that we see we could make a difference with, but it's also recognising that with the right levers and the right resource, this isn't about saving money, but the right resource through a single pot settlement, which we've achieved through the trailblazer negotiations for some bits of money, but local government is yet to see, a single pot settlement that gives us the autonomy to make those differences, to invest in new services, to save the police money. We've got examples and models where that works. So I suppose that the final thing for me is understanding that actually, for a very long time, for governments of many colours, local government has been seen as the unsexy version of frankly getting things done. And I think as we move into a world that has an increasing amount of combined authorities, and we redefine where we operate at scale, utilising hard and soft power with our mayors, we can't overlook the fundamental role that local authorities remain to have in their communities. Because actually there are some really good examples, should those seek to look at it, as to how we have reimagined the bits of the local state that we have control over, but have significant and really exciting ambition to be able to place people at the heart of reimagining the bits that they won't let us have. So we'll keep arguing the fight to have more of those bits, to make more of those changes. But the final thing I'll say is that what I'm not advocating is an incoherent postcode lottery that's dependent on the calibre or the ambition of the local leaders that are doing that. That's a fundamental part of it. But there does have to be accountability. But it has to be accountability to the government that sets some of those metrics, but accountability to people that understands who does what and where. And I'm sure Andy would joke about this as well, the amount of times that we just get both copied into emails complaining about things because people don't know who to complain to. So you complain to the leader of your council, you complain to the mayor, so just complain to them all in one go, is that there is something that we can't let our optimum model of delivery get in the way of what's simple and clear and accountable for local people to understand.
Thank you, Deborah. I think that's a really powerful message, and some of the accountability points we'll come back to in the wider set of questions. So, Ailbhe, turning to yourself, so we know that Power to Change is focused very particularly on the role that local businesses can play to empower communities, solve local problems, all those kinds of things. So what is Power to Change's view for what hyper-local devolution should look like? How can it be implemented in a way that helps create flourishing, diverse local communities?
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Charlie, for inviting us today. I just wanted to start, I suppose, by saying a little bit about Power to Change. I'm not sure everybody here is familiar with us, but we work to support communities, strengthening communities through community businesses, so supporting those organisations that are working at a really local and neighbourhood level, taking on spaces and managing and running services that work to support the local community. And so obviously we would argue for more power to communities, and that is something within this very welcome devolution agenda. We're very pleased about that, and we would always argue for more power to communities. But also, and maybe surprisingly, we also are very much in favour of more powers to the local and regional level as well, because we know from the organisation that we work with and we support that the local authority and the combined authority level are actually very important to that neighbourhood level. Neighbourhood organisations that we fund and support, we ask them every year, we kind of survey the organisations we work with, and they tell us every year that their most important stakeholder is the local authority, because the local state enables, and to be fair, can not enable, can also either be the blocker or it can be the complete enabler for a huge amount that communities want to do. And I think within this whole discussion about devolution, it's very, very important to think about all those levels and how we can make those levels interact and how to make that work well. So we very much welcome the progress that's been made so far. I think what we've been saying, and I would say again today, is we need to keep pushing this. There's an awful lot still to be worked out. So how does this actually work, particularly at a neighbourhood level? And I don't necessarily have a clear answer today, but these are the questions that we're thinking about and working on. So we know that a lot of the organisations we fund and support in communities, and we saw it during COVID, communities coming together with huge potential and achieving an awful lot. But doing it a lot of the time in spite of the system, people really pushing to get the funding, to try and get permission, to try and make things work, and they tell you it's like pushing a rock up a hill. And so, part of what we were trying to do with our work is to understand how this could be unlocked and enabled somehow better. And I think it's very important to think about the reasons why devolution to this hyper-local level matters, and I think there's two big reasons for that. So first of all, public services, as we've both touched on, are facing a huge growing crisis, and we really need to enable that community level approaches where people are able to make decisions for themselves, take things on, understand the need, and address that need better, because we cannot continue in the vein that we have been in. And secondly, it's quite obvious that communities have a huge role to play in placemaking, in pride in place, but not in a superficial level, also in developing local economies and thinking about what a fair economy in a place looks like and how that can be changed. So, I've seen really fantastic examples of community businesses regenerating places and doing it in spite of everything, in a way, taking on buildings and improving places bit by bit. And it would be really fantastic if we could unlock more of that. So I think that the key message for us is, if devolution is going to deliver increased democracy and sort of better economies in places, then it's really got to work at those 3 levels. We have to think about how they work, and there's been a lot of attention on the kind of mayoral deals, and that level I think it's very important to not also forget what happens beneath. So there's some work that we're doing with reform. We're thinking about what powers where, we're calling it, the summary, thinking about actually what powers are best at what levels and how does this work. And I think we also need to do some work on neighbourhood level structures. So, we have parish councils, we have neighbourhood forums, lots of places have neither, and they can take a long time to put in place. So how do you work in places where there necessarily isn't that kind of infrastructure in place? Do you spend a lot of time putting new structures in place, or do you try other things out and work with who's there? And current government have, with the Levelling Up White Paper, committed to sort of look at neighbourhood governance, and they've talked about things like community covenants, which we have been working on piloting. But we just think the progress is very slow in all of this. It's not actually this is very, very important. How can you devolve power and funding to that neighbourhood level if you haven't really thought about the accountability and the structures and how this works? And I'm not arguing for lots and lots of new structures, but just for thinking about how can we work with what's there and how can we ensure that we can, you have to sort of create a sense of trust where you can devolve money and power, but equally you've also got to say, of course we trust this level, it knows best what's needed. I can say a bit more later on about some of the specific ways in which we think that could be achieved, but I'll let Jen pick up for now.
That's really helpful, thank you, Ailbhe. I think the trust point is very well made, and worth saying again, our thanks to Badge Change for kind of supporting the panel. Jen, I'm conscious you're quite a long way away from me, but I'm interested in your sense of the kind of the political conversation about devolution and levelling up. So it's a term that seems to have sort of fallen a little off the radar nationally recently, particularly from the PM, though Michael Gove is as always rather chatty on this. And levelling up has also been something that has kind of been declared dead by various people since last year, but then it comes back, and it seems to go through this kind of constant cycle of it being up and down in the political conversation. So what are you hearing about the political conversation on devolution at the moment from both the main political parties?
Hi, it's lovely to be here. Well, I think we have to start by acknowledging that both levelling up and devolution, but particularly levelling up, is a completely imprecise term, and it's deliberately so because it was it was drummed up as a political slogan, and it's quite clever in that respect. So it's difficult to be precise about this issue because the starting premise is not precise. I think you can split it into 2 broad categories. You can split it into the politics of it, and you can split it into the resulting policy that's come out of it. And I think we know that on politics of it, in the Conservative Party, this largely arose from the 2019 general election, after which there was a kind of broad consensus within the Conservative Party, sort of formed through the existence of Boris Johnson and Brexit, that kind of everybody was a kind of uneasy sort of unity there. And at that point, I think that caucus of MPs that had won seats in the north of England that had not previously, and in the Midlands that had not previously been won by the Conservatives, had a considerable degree of purchase in terms of politics and the way that things were going under the Boris Johnson administration. And you also had a Prime Minister who, politically speaking, wasn't particularly too fussed about sounding interventionist. I didn't mind too much. So, at that stage you did hear a lot about levelling up. Clearly politics has moved on since then. Politics within the Conservative Party has moved on since then. Tory MPs are now, starting to worry far more about what might happen in blue wall seats. MPs like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Dominic Raab looking over their shoulders. There's actually a Northern Research Group conference in Doncaster today that I think Rishi Sunak is attending. Obviously not there, but it will be interesting to see what gets said, what commitments get made, what the rhetoric actually is. Because, you're right in saying that as an agenda, it has very much kind of disappeared, really, from the spotlight since Boris Johnson left Downing Street. And in fact, it was really noticeable during the Tory leadership election, which clearly during that race they were speaking to a certain group of people, but still, it was very noticeable that it wasn't really in the mix at all. On the policy side, clearly Michael Gove has been carrying on in DLUC, formulating policy and in some cases delivering policy. I think the last time I spoke at an event like this, I made the point that if you look at the sort of things from the white paper that have tended to actually come through, they have tended to be things that Local Go's department itself has been in charge of, you know, so arguably perhaps slightly technocratic stuff, but things that DLUC has kind of been getting on and doing. And then probably most significant, I would suggest, out of those things has been the devolution trailblazer deals that came through in the budget. And actually Michael Gove as well has said previously that he's not too bothered about interventionism either. He thinks that it's necessary in terms of market failure and in terms of regeneration in parts of the country where the market isn't going to automatically just carry on and do it. But having said that, we don't seem to be in a place where we, you know, the government isn't really into industrial strategy. More broadly, it doesn't seem to be particularly into interventionism. So I suppose I would say that although it still exists as a show, just about, it's not the biggest show in town. It's perhaps, you know, a bit of street theatre, and it'll be interesting to see how much of a role it plays in the next general election, because obviously in some of these marginal seats, levelling up projects, those levelling up projects that actually are underway by the next general election, they will of course be used as a political selling point by Tory MPs, and there will be projects that are either built or half built or at least on their way by that point, and you can expect to hear a lot about those depending on whether you live in one of those seats. I think on the Labour side, I think we're hearing from Lisa Landy later on. I think Lisa Landy is a genuine advocate of decentralisation, but to come back to my point about the need to be precise, and the point that both of you made about what are we devolving to where and why, I don't think that's something that Labour has entirely resolved. I think that there was some flesh put on the bones in Gordon Brown's review back end of last year, but I still thought it was notable for the absence of detail. It wasn't clear to me what was going to go to what level exactly. I think there's a kind of broad consensus that you know, economic development sits at a sub-regional level because that's the sensible thing to do, but what you send where, below that, seems to be less clear to me from a Labour point of view. And yeah, so I don't know, I mean maybe Lisa will talk a little bit more about that later on, but it seems to me that there's a bit of a tension there. The other, I suppose, as a sceptical journalist, the other thing that I would throw into mix is that Labour have been out of power for 13 years, so even although Keir Starmer says that yes, the first thing I will do if I get into number 10 is hand away power, is that naturally the human instinct that you're going to have when you get into number 10? I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. I suppose the final thing that I would say is that there are many parts of local government and potentially the mayoral system that have got some really quite serious problems that are starting to come through as a legacy of funding problems, as a legacy of accountability structures having been eroded, that mean that there are some quite serious structural issues, and there are also some kind of emerging structural accountability issues in the mayoral system because it's a new and it's an immature system which is still developing. I think the danger is that decentralisation therefore falls off the agenda, or at least is considered to be something that maybe is a bit of a risk because the centre thinks therefore we can't trust people like yourselves. And actually the answer to that is to fix those structural problems, not to simply say that devolution is a risk.
Thank you. Is that working? Thank you very much, Jed. That's really helpful. I think, you know, it's interesting you talk about the Brown Review as well, of course, because I think that came out last December. Very radical, lots of very, very big ideas. What we've seen of that being carried through into everything else, who knows? More for Lisa to pick up in about an hour's time, I think. So moving on to some wider questions for the panel then. So actually, a few of you already talked about the legacy of COVID, so maybe let's start there. I mean, for all the appalling features of the pandemic, we saw in some places, in many places even, a pretty remarkable community response. The development of these hyperlocal mutual aid groups was one common feature, and it made us not only more resilient in the face of the virus, but also offered a much more humane experience for people, whether it's shielding, isolating, all that kind of thing. So beyond COVID, from what you've each seen, have we slipped back from that, or have we failed to learn the lessons about what communities can do to make us more resilient. So who would like to start there? Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll start.
Sorry, I turned it off so they couldn't hear us.
That's all right. So was COVID humane? And I know that's not, absolutely it was inhumane. And what it did was expose a whole series of inconvenient truths, which was that those communities that were experiencing structural inequalities on a whole range of levels, COVID just exacerbated that and exposed that. And as the local state, we had to respond to that. So, you know, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, you know, all of those events where local people said, we have had enough. And for the local state not to continue to respond to that, I think would be not catastrophic, but it would be it would just be a nightmare. So we can't ignore what COVID exposed, which was, yes, it was brilliant. It was brilliant in terms of, you know, engaging people kind of finding their humanity and volunteering, all of that, and the kind of social movement that we saw in our local communities. It was brilliant, but it did expose those structural inequalities that are, for some people, inconvenient truth. And what I would say is if the government is expecting levelling up to address some of those structural inequalities, I think they're sorely mistaken. And the first thing is, you know, levelling up will not happen in one political term. It is a generational thing that we need to focus on. So the local state has to be committed to working in a sustainable way in our communities to address those things.
Yeah, I guess I suppose I'd put the challenge back, because I think it shone a spotlight on lots of things that were already there. And I think that's in many ways the fundamental point, is that communities are strong and have been doing strong things for each other for a long time. Local authorities and local services have been delivering good local services, working with communities, in communities for a long time. What COVID did in many ways was shine a spotlight on that. I'm sure there's lots of examples of additionality, you know, some of those mutual aid groups, some of those situational specific groups, but actually that's the kind of community action that we're used to, just in a different form. So I guess my challenge would be that it could be that the state nationally and the media nationally have been overlooking lots of great things that are already happening in our communities to begin with. And the second is that we all know that people experience COVID differently. And when you look at the structure of the workforce in cities like Manchester, many of our residents had to work the entirety of the pandemic, didn't get to enjoy working from home and going for a jog before work and walking the dog at lunchtime because they were working, and often disproportionately impacted as that from a health and a financial consequence. So I think we just need to be careful around recognising the ingredients, the good things that happened that already pointed to strong communities, but not necessarily romanticising the notion that when crisis hits, people step up. That's people, that's human nature, and actually maybe we don't focus enough on that positive component of communities to begin with. I think the bits though that have had a legacy, and I'll talk about the Manchester specific situation, is that we'd already prior to COVID changed the way we began to work with communities. So through our model of working with voluntary community sector organisations, we began to change. What COVID did though was accelerate our work, particularly around racial inequalities, and I say the intersection of health and wealth inequalities and how they're disproportionately experienced by some of our communities. So Manchester is a city, we speak over 200 languages. In terms of our population, we have round about 45% of our population that are non-white, heralding from places across the world. Too often in the past, local services have thought about our communities as that add-on, haven't they? So the amount of times you go to a meeting or event over the last 10 years and people say, oh, we need to do more to engage with diverse communities. And it's like, mate, the communities are diverse, they're the people you should be engaging with anyway. You don't need special measures. So I think COVID in the city of Manchester actually became a really powerful precursor to what's now one of our flagship programmes, which is called Making Manchester Fairer. And that's about how you embed the learning of exacerbating inequalities by any kind of global incident, be it COVID, but probably lessons that we should have learned from the financial crash and austerity, if we're completely honest. So I think there are some home truths that have come from COVID that services at the local, the regional and the national level have to be able to step in and do. But that's when we go back to the point that actually communities are the solution to that. And we've been very clear with our programmes that actually it's community voice, not community gatekeepers, that are driving some of those long-term changes that they need to see and experience from the state.
Yeah, well, I think me and Bev experienced a lot of the same things during COVID because, well, Bev was in charge of health at the council. I was trying to cover what was going on at Manchester Evening News. So, we've had similar headaches trying to get our heads around things at various points. I think for me the pandemic, the most kind of clear demonstration from the pandemic of what we're talking about is simply the infection rate map. Because it clearly shows that the different ways in which the virus spread in different parts of the country reflected the different demographic mixes, the different housing mixes, the different economic mixes, the different transport access and so on, and the different levels of structural deprivation and so on. So you can see that very clearly. All of that, as Bev says, was there before. It all existed, and it simply shows that having some kind of one-size-fits-all policy towards things clearly doesn't work if you've got such variations in geography. I think that Bev's much more able to speak to the policy legacy from the pandemic. One of the things that strikes me is that we've had lots of talk of early intervention and prevention, and that seemed to me to be one of the obvious lessons that came out of the pandemic, was that a lot of that stuff had kind of fallen away, that public health had not been prioritised over the last sort of decade or so. I'm not sure that the lesson from that has nationally necessarily been learned. I've not really seen the health inequality agenda, which was supposed to be part of the Levelling Up White Paper, but I've not really seen it talked about recently. So although you may have individual local authorities that have picked up some of the lessons from this, I'm never quite clear that that is true within central government policy. And the thing about prevention work is that essentially it's going to save you that massive NHS bill if you're willing to invest in it now, right? It's just that that's where this runs up against the short-termism of our politics, because these outcomes take time to demonstrate, right? If you're going to put it on a spreadsheet, then the outcome is probably going to be 10 or 15 years down the line. It's the similar argument to why should you invest in Northern Rail when the business case doesn't stack up? Well, I mean, it doesn't at the moment, but it will do eventually if you just do it. So it's, you go round and round in circles on it. So I think the short-termism of the way that national policy thinks is a hindrance to some of this stuff. And of course, I think one thing just to kind of throw in is that everything that you're talking about, the private sector has also got an important role to play in all of this, and sometimes it doesn't kind of get mentioned enough in the conversation.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add a bit. I mean, just go back to your question of kind of has COVID sort of made that difference? I sort of feel like yes and no. So absolutely what you both said about, and I see that we directly support a lot of organisations, and we encounter a lot of other funders and organisations doing similar. And I think COVID made everyone kind of see things that had already been there, one around the power of community organisations and just those networks and what already is in place and works. And we did some work with Simon and his old guys in the summer of 2020, we thought we were coming out of COVID at that point. And we looked at local authorities and their responses and how well they responded and how well it had worked. And they found, which is entirely obvious, but the places that had those strong pre-existing community connections and that good understanding in place in those networks, it worked best. And it's sort of both obvious but needed researching for us to be able to talk about it. So I think that, it made that obvious. And the second thing that was the sort of the disadvantaged communities and the structural inequalities, suddenly everybody saw it in a way that we hadn't really been able to, I don't hope they're failing, but we hadn't had that before. So I think those things are both positive, but then you get on to you know, things like the Levelling Up Fund and, you know, and the continuing centralisation. So, you know, really good, as an example, a really good community organisation that we know is doing great work in the community and really sort of quite a sophisticated one, can't bid into the Levelling Up Fund, so trying to bid in with its local authority, and they're being very proactive and it's actually working very well. And it's all stymied in the end because, you know, the community organisation has to get a separate economic impact assessment for itself, separate to what the local authority does, to put into central government, for central government to decide whether X, Y, or Z is good for their area. Yeah, so yes and no, the lessons kind of, you know, we've seen a lot of things and a lot of things become very clear, but equally I don't think we've seen that shift in how centralised, you know, how money is devolved and how power is actually distributed still.
I just wanted to make another contribution because it just made me feel better if nothing else. I mean, one of the things we did find, everyone had to instigate emergency arrangements. What we did find is that the central government representatives on the local bodies spent all of their time catching up. And what I mean by that, they would say, well, you need to this, and we say, chill your beans, we've got this, you know, we did it last week, or, you know, it was this kind of inconvenient truth that how can local government not only be ahead of the game, but actually doing stuff that is meaningful and is having an impact, but more importantly, doing the right thing for their communities. And I think one of the things, Bev, that I don't think local government has been very good at is capitalising on that, actually, and reminding central government that actually, in events like that, it is local government that works with its local communities to make the difference and have the right impact. So,
I mean, I completely understand this because they've changed about 16 times. But I would echo that, and I think as we move through, it's probably a bit of a faux pas to go down this route, but I've started it, so I keep going down the rabbit hole. As we move through the COVID inquiry and some of the things that begin to come out of that, there are small examples that I think will point to national policy decisions that actually were wrong. And I suppose the example that I'd give, and Jen knows this deeply, because we spent a lot of time, mostly me pacing in my front room, trying to subtly explain privately, confidentially, without dropping my NHS colleagues in it, what we were doing. But one of the examples, and if I tell it a different way, is that as the pandemic began to take hold, so pre-national lockdown, we in Manchester made a decision on the 16th of March, before the national lockdown happened, that ultimately could have got chief executives of hospitals and my director of public health in trouble. And that decision that we took was that we in Manchester wouldn't discharge patients from hospital to care homes without testing them first. And we argued privately, consistently with government, that this wasn't the right thing to do. Nationally, they issued the edict, clear them out, get them out of hospitals, move them as quickly as they can. And from the 17th of March, prior to the national lockdown, Manchester hospitals were testing everybody that was discharged into care homes. And if you look at those early phases of disease management within care homes, Manchester's was comparably lower to other people. Now at the time, trying to explain that to officials, we got into all sorts of trouble. We ended up as local authorities having to leak things to the press on behalf of the NHS, because the NHS weren't allowed to speak to the press. And actually, as you start to think about what does localism really mean, how do you quantify the benefits of, we talk about trust and those relationships that we establish in local services. The notion that a chief executive of one of the largest hospital trusts in the country should listen to a bit of a gobshite politician like me, because I think I know best, has to come from a place that we do collectively know best. And I think there's some really good examples of that that'll never get written up, that'll never be quantified in a way, because lots of good people operated outside of the margins to do the right thing. What's fundamentally the right thing for residents. And the chief executive retired now, so I can say.
That's great, thank you, Beth. So I promised half the time for audience Q&A. I think we've reached that point now. So we'll take questions in groups of two. Please obviously provide your name, the organisation you're from, and then your question. So there should be two, including this one, roaming mics coming. Let's go there. Right here.
Hi all, Trevor McNabola from an organisation called Culture Commons. We support the creative industries and the cultural sector. And I've definitely got another question on how devolution might affect actually creating cultural life of the nation, which is less bureaucratic, but I think potentially more important and politically sensitive as well. And my question is about a future constitution. There are ideas knocking around that we might need a UK constitution to underpin devolution as a principle and to rebalance the economy based on a new Bill of Rights, so to speak, so the right to have equal access to ... services, culture, etc. So I'd love to know what your view on a UK constitution might be. And lastly, a cheeky one, I wonder what you think about role of LEPs and whether they're staying, going, what? Thanks.
Yeah, let's.
Thank you. Well, first off, thanks for a really interesting debate. So I really enjoyed that. Paul Simpson, I'm the Chief Executive of City Council. Other than the word COVID, I think the word that was used most in that conversation was trust, which I think is quite interesting. And I guess I just wonder. I guess it was suggested, or more than suggested, that part of the challenge that we have as particularly local authorities is the government doesn't trust us. I guess my question would be, why is that? But is it just trust, or is it also understanding?
That's great. So we have a question on constitution, I suppose, and trust, and also the cheeky one, if anyone wants to take that. So who would like to?
Start at this side.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll come in on the big come in on the UK Constitution. Oh my God. I have a bit of a counter offer. So there's a campaign group that we've been involved with called the We're Right Here campaign, which is a group of some of them are nodding excellent, they're cutting through. Which is led by some community leaders from across the country, different backgrounds, and we support that campaign, which essentially that is calling for a Community Power Act. So it might not be a rewrite of the Constitution or a Bill of Rights, but it is and essentially, for those who are familiar with the Localism Act, it would be just strengthening and really beefing up that Localism Act, which was sort of great progress in getting it, but equally it actually hasn't had the teeth and it hasn't delivered the impact it could have had. So strengthening that Localism Act with the new Community Power Act, which would give communities a right to buy instead of a right to bid on basis an asset. So if you've got an asset like this in your community that the community would actually like to get their hands on, they've got stronger rights to do so. But also rights around shaping public services and being able to direct where investment goes in your local area. There's lots more to read about that if you want to read about the We're Right Here campaign, but I do think there is some, it's tricky with powers and legislation because you can put them in place like the Localism Act, but then actually, they don't really happen in reality. But at the same time, there's something symbolic, and sort of in making that commitment, there's something there, and that's why we back that call for the Community Power Act.
Thanks. I'll come in quickly on trust and even more quickly on LEPs. On trust, I think there's a long-standing problem, isn't there, in this country about the way the centre views the local level, and that has evolved over a long time. Probably started, a lot of the history of this tends to be told from the 80s onwards, but really, predates that in some respects. So I think some of that is about a kind of ingrained centralisation within British culture that seems to be becoming more and more the case, and I think that's partly why, for me, the kind of devolution agenda matters not just for the things that you can put into a spreadsheet, but for the kind of the cultural shift. The example that I always use is the difference that it's made moving the BBC to Salford. That like some of the benefits of that are actually quite hard to measure in a graph. But if you listen to BBC national programmes that are made in Salford, I can tell the difference. I can tell that there is just a slightly different perspective, and the people that are making the programmes are just seeing and living a slightly different part of the country. So I think that the trust problem is one that has evolved. But yes, to your question, is it also about understanding? I think that's inevitable. I think that the people that you guys were talking to during the pandemic, either the kind of more local civil servants or people who were down in Whitehall, how certainly Whitehall-based civil servants, how can you possibly have an understanding of all of the different pictures in all of the different places across the country? I think that's absolutely inevitable. but I think that you know, we're in an incremental process, and part of the job is to gradually rebuild that level of trust and that level of understanding. And you know, actually, to come back to my point earlier on, if the sort of the fragile level of trust that exists in Whitehall at the moment is undermined by the problems that exist in the system, then actually, you know, that's the wrong way around. We need to be looking at what problems we've got in the system and why, so that trust and that understanding can be built up. On the labs, my understanding is that they're pretty much heading out the door. I'm not sure that in a lot of places they'll necessarily be that missed from the conversations that I've had. But I'll leave that.
Poor labs, poor labs. So I would say though, is that actually, just on labs, where they can provide a purpose and a benefit, places will keep them in an iteration that works for them. So we in GM will keep our version for them, because actually the Greater Manchester Business Board is able to reach into places that the state can't. And to be honest, combined authorities probably shouldn't be in some of those spaces. If I think about some of the really innovative stuff we're doing, be it around innovation here at Manchester, be it around some of the bits around sectoral innovation that we see through the Trailblazer, you know, City Council and combined authority staff aren't the best experts to be telling us how we need to be creating innovative AI ecosystems, for example, which is one of the real hubs we're starting to see in GM, and nor should we be. So I think when LEPs have a role in a system speaking to clear economic and social geography, then you know I think there are ways to enable them and make them work. I think the Constitution points I think to something that's a little bit more fundamental. If power and control is to shift, you need to write it down. And whether that goes down the territory, I don't think there's a groundswell for a Bill of Rights where people feel at the moment like they can't get a doctor's appointment, the schools are crumbling, kids are going hungry. I think there's a perception challenge with the public. But I think anything that looks at power and control will have to be done in a way that works with citizens but writes things down through government. And I know there's been talk within some Labour circles around looking at comparable living standards, not dissimilar to what's been done in Germany, around how you build in what people can realistically expect from the state, and that probably lends itself to something of a broader conversation, particularly on the likes of culture, because actually what does quantify good life, and how are you able to capture that beyond simple productivity measures and old-fashioned kind of GDP, GVA measures for a good society. So I think that's a broader discussion. I think on the point of trust, I would say that, you know, obviously there's been a long time debate discussion around this, and it's something that we've talked about, particularly with the Labour side of the Local Government Association and the councils. I think that there has to be accountability, but that accountability isn't currently based on trust. So if you look at some of the suggestions coming out of BOFLOG at the moment, the suggested regulator for local government, the risk is you get a whole bunch of metrics that lends you into that old age-old kind of data-rich intelligence pool. How can you compare the number of fly tipping instances recorded in a city like Manchester to a borough council that's just not comparable? So I think measuring the right things gives confidence. I also think there is a discussion within local government at the moment as well about our own standards and holding ourselves to account. Lots of councils do really great things. Some councils aren't so good. You just have to look at Woking at the moment, going bankrupt with a multi-billion pounds debt list. So I think a bit of honesty and accountability wins local government quite a lot of favours actually, in terms of recognising some of that self-awareness. But the final thing I'll say is that what you can't just measure us on, and we all like to talk about outcomes, but if you get to the territory of measuring local authorities in population outcomes, actually we don't have those levers to be measured on. So if you start measuring Manchester and Birmingham around child poverty rates, but you don't think about the role of the benefit cap, freezing in the LHA, the reduction of the state over the last 13 years, and every other social policy decision that's been taken for well over a decade, they're not fair measures either. So we're not yet there, but I think kind of self-awareness of what needs to change and a discussion, hopefully, with the government who listens to local government, respects local government. We just hit Lisa walking in, so it's a nice moment to put on the spot. But I think that self-awareness in local government that we want to mutually improve and talk about who takes power at what level is really helpful.
I'll just be very quick because I won't repeat what my colleagues have said. And actually, I just would want to make the point that this is an all-woman panel, so I think we should applaud that.
I should apologise for the slightly Yes.
I just wanted to reflect on the issue about power and trust. Is it about they don't trust us? Is it? Or is it because they view us doing stuff differently to how they would want and expect it to be done at a local level? And it is about lack of trust in power and accountability. And I think as the local state, as Bev has said, we need to step up a bit more. One of the mantras I use is proceed until apprehended. Certainly on the basis of working with our communities, doing the right thing in our communities, delivering the right services in the right way to our communities as well. So let's not be seduced by this powerlessness about, the government don't trust us, therefore we can't do stuff, and collude in this kind of, parent-child relationship that sometimes is kind of promoted. I think we should, I sound like a revolutionary, don't I? But I think we should just take a bit of control over this and be accountable, but also demonstrate that 9 times out of 10, the local state knows this.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly add, and to come back on your point about whether it's trust. The thing that struck me during the pandemic when I was talking to people about kind of attempts to get things at a local level done, but sort of struggling with central government, was that perhaps it was less about trust and more just about ignorance about what it is local government actually do. But like just on an automatic basis, what local government does every single day, there was a surprising lack of understanding centrally about what that actually looked like. And just to add on the trust thing, it isn't just about our older local government structures and that relationship with central government, but of course we do also have a new layer of government that is evolving within the mayoral system, and I think that now is the right time to be having a conversation about how you ensure that that system is trusted, both from central government, which I think is very important, and we've seen that conversation play out during the Trailblazer deals, where you've got these kind of new select committee things that government has decided to include for Andy Burnham and Andy Street, but also for the public as well. Because if you don't have a system that can be trusted and is accountable, then it completely loses legitimacy, and it's quite new. So now is the point, I think, to be having that conversation, and to be honest, if there is a problem, well, let's have a look at it.
John Bertram from the University of Sheffield. Really interested in what we're all saying, but it struck me that a few years ago we ran a programme for DCMS called Enabling Social Action, which brought together local authorities and the voluntary sector and community groups across the country. And interestingly, sessions that we had with them was local authorities need to learn to let go. They don't trust us. They won't let us get on and do things for ourselves. I'm just wondering, it sounds the same but up at the other level. How do we get to that point? And we saw it in COVID where the permission to act really came forward. People were given that chance to do it. But we've seen, certainly we've been doing a lot of moving back to retrenching into the old ways of working, the same arguments, but they're not giving us the trust to let go. How do we shift that balance? Are we in danger of devolving down to another group of people who don't want to let go?
Deborah, University of Manchester. Can also pick up on the theme of trust and segue into levelling up, and just a general way of levelling up. If you look at levelling up white paper, what's interesting about levelling up white paper was the first quarter of it was one of the strongest critiques of the way government as a whole operates. It had apologies there, top-downism, centralisation, siloisation, all these things we're very, very familiar with. If you then come on to what the prescriptions were for reform, it then half-sided the coins and simply looked at not first-line centre reforming below. Similarly, if you go back to those who have long remembered to 1997, when Labour came into power, they talked about reforming public services, and they talked about moving away from one size fits all. All of these things we talked about today, and subsidiarity in that principle. What do we end up with? Public service agreements, a cascading culture of targets that came down from the centre. And so constantly what we see a mindset from is the centre, vital, talk about reform, recognising problems, but when prescriptions come simply to reform from below and not the centre. And that runs on the problem.
Thank you. So, two points there. Who would like to start?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that local authority to community level, because obviously that's one that we encounter a lot. And so I think I mentioned this when I started, but yeah, we hear in equal measure from community organisations, community businesses we're working with, that either the local authority is sort of doesn't understand and is holding on to power, won't let them kind of get on to what they want to do, or that it's been the sort of enabler that's really helped, depending on how that relationship is. And so I think a lot of it is about just continuing to push on that, you know. So as an example, we've been piloting an idea called community improvement districts this last year or so. So building the idea of a business improvement district, we're thinking about high streets and town centres where people increasingly live, but actually the community doesn't really have that same input into how a place is developed as the businesses do. And so we've been working with local authorities. You know, we're piloting those in 7 places in England, and we've had Camden Council and various other places where the councils, the business improvement district, and the local community are working together to say, actually, there's something about that. You know, those three groups care about a place: the private sector, people who live there, and the council, and sort of other institutions of the state. So I do think that recognise that problem is there. That sort of tension of getting power from the local authority down to communities, but also we've just got to try some of these examples and make it work, and then if it works, try and do it somewhere else, etc. I do appreciate it's a long slog, essentially, but that is something that we're trying to do.
I'll address the levelling up stuff really, and I do get a little bit frustrated when we collude with this really, and we should call it for what it is. You know, it isn't complicated, is it? It is about, you know, clearly identifying those places where people's life chances are rubbish and where investment is not attracted to. You know, and if you've got a proper industrial strategy for the UK, you start from a different place, don't you? But the place that you have to start with is those places that are experiencing that disadvantage and that market failure. There needs to be a conversation with the local state, with the local authority, with the local communities, which is what would help? What do you think you need to do in order for you to create a level playing field where your kids have got hope and aspiration and access to good quality jobs, where the kind of conditions for success are set in terms of connectivity and, you know, the right levels of investment. You know, start from the right place. Don't you know, suggest that what the government is doing is levelling up our most disadvantaged communities. You know, building a bridge isn't going to achieve that. And it's got to be about investing in people just as much as it is about investing in stuff.
Fire today, Deborah. Love it. So I think, I mean, I would echo all of that. I think, you know, you just have to read, and look, I'll start by saying, the premise of rebalancing an unbalanced country is a good one that we would all share. A thesis, I think, that sets down some of the challenges from a government in power without many of the without a clear action plan as to how you're going to invest in delivering that, I think is always going to be the challenge. For a government in power, not a think tank, to set out the premise of the problem around solutions. And I think we're yet to see a lot of the solutions that come from it. And I think that's the basis on which you have to judge it, because so far all we've really had is a national pot that we can compete with each other to bid into for some extra hanging baskets, a leisure centre or a bridge. You know, let's be honest about what structural funding has flowed as a consequence of supposedly the seismic moment in British politics, where we recognise that actually the state has imbalanced our economy and perhaps spanned for decades on end. So I think that's probably where the frustration when people talk about how are we doing with levelling up. It was never meant to be there. Let's see it for what it was. And over the next 12 to 18 months, as an election moves closer, it will become increasingly clear, I think, as to what that scheme is for. And I probably don't need to do the part of politics on that front. But I think though, there's a broader point that actually touches on your point around power and the appetite for people to let it go when they have it. And I think when you think about some of the critiques that we have of Whitehall in holding on to that power, the risk is with combined authorities, we have mini Whitehalls in sub-regional economies, and that we can then replicate that behaviour even at a local level. So I think the principles of doing things differently, we have an opportunity through what we're saying devolution to be able to reset some of those principles. I think particularly when it comes to voluntary community sector organisations, and we've internally been on a journey on this massively over the last 5 or 6 years, around how we can make it easier having a single point of contact for a voluntary community sector, about how you can change the bidding parts and transform it into one. But the elephant in the room is money. So my revenue budget at the minute is about £730 million a year. That's £430 million a year less than it would have been had the cuts have not happened. My revenue budget would be over £1 billion. And it's that stuff that's been shaved, it's that stuff that's been taken away, because over 2/3 of my spend now go on statutory services like most other local authorities. So I think the will and the intent, balanced with, I think, the desire and the need to make sure that everybody gets access to a limited pot of money fairly, often has perverse decisions that make it difficult for voluntary community organisations. And without hogging the microphone, there's probably just one example I've given that. Every time we open our voluntary community sector grants funding, it's massively oversubscribed. We can spend it 10 times over. But there are communities that are disproportionately not represented in those bids, and sometimes the state has to take a role in being the arbiter of fairness to make sure that some of those communities get to have a chance as well. So I think something we would all ascribe to and sign up to, but in the absence of proper resource to do what we want to do with communities, does make it much more difficult.
Yeah, I was just going to come back in on the levelling up white paper. Yeah, I don't think there was many people in local government that didn't recognise the analysis in the first section of that paper. It seemed to me that it seemed to then kind of turn into a trickle of things that departments had sort of shoved in as a bit of an afterthought, you know? Like, yeah, that sounds kind of levelling up, we'll put that in. And the idea of the mission was supposed to be that, you know, Michael Gove could use that as a lever to kind of force it through Whitehall. And it doesn't feel to me as though that has necessarily happened. If you're going to pursue an agenda like this in a country that is as uneven as we are, you know, ours is, if you look at how long it's taken Germany to turn the dial in any, you know, measurable sense, then you have to have it as a cross-governmental policy, and it has to be something that is at the heart of every departmental sort of way of policy thinking. And in fairness, I think Michael Gove has tried to do that, but I'm not sure how successful that's really been. So I mean, if for any incoming Labour government, that's going to be the same challenge.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for just one more. So, Madam, did you want to ask your question? Because you were up last time, weren't you? Rachel, right in the middle here, on the third row, I think.
Hi, from Melbourne, from Deputy Leader of Sheffield City Council. So I've actually spent a lot longer in the voluntary sector than I have in local government. So I very much recognise what my colleague from the university was talking about earlier. And I think, having spent that time, I think you're absolutely right to say around councils needing to be able to give up power. But I think there's another side to it as well, which is empowering communities and community organisations to ask for that power, rather than just asking for a bigger slice of a smaller pie. And it's empowering and emboldening, and how we actually make that difference within communities and in the voluntary sector especially. I think some organisations are out there, you know, championing at the bit for that, which is great. But as you say, you know, making sure that we're empowering all communities still requires people to be asking the right questions, and I think it comes back as well to the question you raised earlier about how much detail there is in Labour's policy on devolution. A lot of it is about who is asking for the power and not how much Labour is going to give.
That's really helpful, thank you. So we've got 5 minutes left, so do we have any brief responses from Ailbhe, Alice, on that? That would be, this is too brief so far.
What? Right. I mean, look, I think we've learned with the microphone brevity is not my friend. I suppose it's summing up all of what we've talked about today, isn't it? Because I think for me, those themes as to, I'd go back to where we started. What you want to do with the power should be driving where the power goes. And I think if you miss that point, around actually what it is that we're trying to deliver, then you miss, it's a philosophical or an intellectual argument as to who gets to hold the lever if you don't know what the lever wants to do. And I think that it has been a reflection, and I will just come in on something that Jan said, is that actually there is a lesson for any government in the future that having one department drive through a mission of government or a mission for the country doesn't work. And we've seen that. I don't doubt that Michael Gove doesn't believe what he's written. He just doesn't have the levers, even within his own government control, to be able to do that. So I think, kind of to take us back to the very beginning, that if we're talking about, the topic of today, reimagining the local state, why? Why do we want to reimagine it and who for? Decide who for and what you're going to do with it, and suddenly it becomes clearer who you should be giving those levers to. And when you can answer the right question, suddenly should it be community groups, should it be the voluntary sector, should it be local government, or is there an argument at times in some policy areas, which I think there are, actually, for those levers to be held at a higher level. But the blueprint has to cover all of that societal change that you want to see. Otherwise, it's a piecemeal discussion. It's a piecemeal discussion that doesn't energise the electorate. The amount of times I can talk in detail about the powers that if only we had over this bit of government control, and residents say, well, what difference does that make to my life? And I think that's the challenge. And I suppose the final thing I'll say is using human examples that sit with it. So when I talk to you about actually, 83% of our children that were in need of a children in need plan through early help didn't need support afterwards. What does that mean for that family? Or if I talk about investing in the local police force, investing in youth services rather than chasing criminals down the road, what does that mean for those families? So I think that's the trick, isn't it? To bring the public with us on the changes that we want to do. That essentially, see, much of what we do is a back office function. When I go out and speak to voters, they're not really interested in the ins and outs as to how many local government departments they have, how we work with the combined authority, and who from Whitehall comes and gives us those levers. They want us to crack on as the state, to deliver for them, to improve their lives, and they don't want to have to think about it. So I suppose that's the lesson, isn't it? Whoever holds the lever, and wherever that lever is held, actually, are we getting out of the way quick enough to make it a seamless service that the public doesn't need to know who presses the button?
Deborah, did you want to come in very, very briefly?
I'm not sure that that's predefined and then coming in after my politician. But anyway, so we started off with talking about the state, community and market and how important those were. But actually, the conversations for me mean that we probably need to stop overcomplicating things and be really focused about what it is that people care about and how they live their lives. And in Birmingham we talk about 4 lenses, and I do want to pick up the cultural point because it's really important. So, and it's not very complicated. People care about how they live, what houses they live in. They care about how they connect and travel around. They care about how they work and learn. And then the final bit is my particular favourite, which is they care about how they love and feed their soul. So we haven't got time to talk about the question you raised about culture, but I do think it's something that we need to see as something really important and something that kind of, I think it was exposed after COVID as well. That kind of health and well-being, how people fed their soul and how people were able to love and connect was just as important as the houses they lived in. So let's not overcomplicate this, but let's understand how communities want to live and how individuals want to kind of live their lives and what's important to them.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind of powerful note to end on. That takes us up to time there. It's been a really fantastic conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground, both from our panellists and the audience. Obviously, Lisa and Andy is up next, waiting in the wings. Before that, Please do give a round of applause to our panel for today. Thank you.